Lauren stood at the railing of the cruise ship, staring at the distant shore of Miami. The warm Caribbean breeze played with her blonde hair, and her brand-new engagement ring glistened on her ring finger. Dexter put his arm around her shoulders from behind, and she smiled, smelling the familiar scent of his perfume. "I can't believe this is really happening," Lauren whispered, snuggling up to her husband. She still remembered that July day when she had first seen him. The Ocean Point Hotel in Key West was the most luxurious place she'd ever stayed. She'd been saving for this trip for almost a year, saving from her modest teacher's salary. That evening, she sat by the pool, watching the sunset and sipping a cocktail. Dexter walked by in the company of business associates, but suddenly stopped and sat down next to her. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" This trite phrase started a conversation that lasted well into the night. She was fascinated by his listening skills. Most successful men just talk about themselves, but Dexter asked questions about her work at the elementary school, the children she teaches, her dreams. When she talked about her passion for photography, he offered to show her the hotel's hidden spots that offered magical views. "What are you thinking about?" Dexter's voice brought her back to reality. "Thinking back to our acquaintance? Who would have thought that 2 months later you'd propose to me?" Dexter turned her toward him and kissed her tenderly. "When you meet your destiny, it's foolish to delay." Their wedding was modest, just close friends and family. Lauren's father, a school teacher of mathematics, at first wary of the groom, who was almost twice as old as his daughter. But Dexter had quickly charmed him with his sincerity and concern for his future wife. Now they stood on the deck of the luxury cruise ship Caribbean Dream. The 2-week wedding voyage was just beginning. Exotic islands, secluded beaches, and romantic sunsets awaited them ahead. "Come on, darling, it's time for our welcome cocktail." Dexter took her hand. Other passengers were already gathering in the main salon. Men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns, just like in the movies. Their table was next to a small stage where a jazz quartet was playing. Lauren adjusted her dark blue dress, a gift from Dexter especially for the cruise. Waiters were serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "Mr. Kane, good to have you aboard." The ship's captain approached their table. "This is my wife, Lauren," Dexter proudly introduced her. "It's a pleasure. I hope you enjoy the trip. By the way, your stateroom is one of the best on the ship, with a beautiful view of the ocean." After the welcoming speeches and toasts, the entertainment program began. Lauren watched her husband chatting casually with the other guests. In his 39, he looked elegant and attractive, tall, trim, with a slight gray on his temples, giving him a special charm. A young bartender who introduced himself as Sid approached their table. "Let me offer you our signature cocktail." He placed a glass of blue liquid in front of Lauren, garnished with an orchid. "Try one," Dexter smiled. Sid is quite the magician. He can read guests' wishes. The cocktail was delicious, fresh and light, with subtle notes of passion fruit and mint. "It's amazing," Lauren marveled sincerely. The evening flew by. When they returned to the cabin, the moon was already reflecting in the dark waters of the Caribbean Sea. Lauren stepped out onto their private balcony and breathed deeply of the salty sea air. "You know," she said as Dexter joined her, "I never thought I'd be this happy." He put his arm around her and they stood in silence for a long time, looking up at the stars. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of another ship twinkled, and the waves splashed quietly against the side of the vessel below. The first night of their honeymoon was just beginning. The morning greeted Lauren with the Caribbean sun streaming through the panoramic windows of their cabin. Dexter was already sitting at his laptop on the balcony, checking email. She went over to kiss her husband and noticed on the screen a long correspondence with Aurora about some contracts. "Sorry, darling, minor work issues. A hotel in Miami needs my attention." Dexter quickly closed the lid of the laptop. "Let's get some breakfast, shall we?" The restaurant on the upper deck was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, snow-white tablecloths, silverware, waiters in impeccable uniforms scurried between tables with trays. "Mrs. Kane, may I recommend the freshest croissants and tropical fruit?" The maitre d' gallantly pulled back a chair for her. After breakfast, Dexter excused himself. He had to have a video conference. Lauren went to explore the ship. She wandered the decks, looking at the designer clothing stores, the spa, the casino, and the theater. The very top deck had pools surrounded by lounge chairs. "Would you like a refreshing cocktail?" The familiar voice belonged to Sid, who was working at the pool today. "I'd love one. What do you recommend?" "For a sunny day like this, a mango and passion fruit mix with mint. How are the first few days of the trip treating you?" Lauren settled back on the chaise lounge, sipping her cold drink. "It's like a fairy tale. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this." By lunchtime, Dexter appeared in the company of a young woman with fiery red hair. "Meet Aurora Price, my indispensable assistant. She's joined the cruise to help me with some business matters." Aurora smiled welcomingly. "It's nice to finally meet you in person. Dexter has told me so much about you." Over lunch, Aurora and Dexter discussed some figures and contracts while Lauren watched silently. The assistant spoke quickly and confidently, occasionally showing something in her clipboard. After lunch, Dexter disappeared again for another meeting. Lauren returned to the pool where she met an elderly couple from Boston. They got to talking, and the time flew by. In the evening, there was a performance in the main salon where an illusionist was performing amazing tricks. Lauren sat next to her husband, resting her head on his shoulder. Aurora settled 2 tables away from them, typing something quickly into her phone. "Our first stop tomorrow is St. Thomas Island," Dexter whispered. "Do you want to take a tour?" "Sure. Aren't you busy?" "I'll always make time for you." He squeezed her hand gently. At night, Lauren couldn't sleep for a long time. She stood on the balcony looking out at the starry sky and the dark ocean. Somewhere in the distance there was a flash, perhaps lightning or the lights of another ship. Muffled voices were heard in the next cabin, Dexter seeming to be on the phone again. She made out Aurora's name and some numbers. Lauren sighed. Even on their honeymoon, work kept her husband busy. In the morning, they were awakened by a knock on the door as the waiter brought breakfast to the room. Dexter looked a little tired but was smiling as always. "I'm sorry about last night. I promise I'm all yours tonight. I'll show you the most beautiful places on the island." Lauren smiled back, but something was bothering her. Perhaps it was just being unused to the sea air or the slight rocking. She pushed the troubling thoughts away. They had a full day on the Paradise Island ahead of them. The day on St. Thomas had been wonderful. They'd walked the picturesque streets, bathed in the turquoise water, and taken pictures of the ancient forts. But in the evening, Dexter was back to work. Lauren was flipping through photos on her phone when she got a text from her husband. "I'll be late in the conference room. Have dinner without me." She decided to have a cocktail at the bar on the upper deck where Sid worked. "Alone tonight?" the bartender asked, placing a glass of pina colada in front of her. "Husband's busy with work. It seems that even on his honeymoon, his hotels require constant attention. You know, I've seen a lot of stories in my 5 years working on cruise ships." Sid wiped his glass as he spoke. "I remember one couple. They honeymooned here too. The husband was a successful businessman, always on the phone. And then it turned out he didn't have any business. He was losing his wife's money at an online casino." Lauren laughed nervously. "Dexter has a real hotel chain. I've been to a few." "Sure, fine. I'm just sharing stories." Sid smiled. "Another cocktail?" Back in the cabin, Lauren discovered that Dexter had forgotten his laptop. The screen wasn't locked, and her gaze happened to fall on open mail. The email from Aurora said something about an urgent stock sale and the threat of bankruptcy. Lauren quickly closed the laptop lid, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. Dexter returned past midnight. He smelled like whiskey. "Everything okay?" Lauren asked cautiously. "Of course, darling. Just some complicated negotiations." He kissed her forehead and left to shower. The next morning they had breakfast on the balcony. Aurora walked past their table several times, each time casting worried glances at Dexter. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" Lauren finally asked. "What do you mean?" "I saw the letter about the bankruptcy." Dexter turned pale, but quickly pulled himself together. "A little financial trouble, nothing serious, we can handle it." At that moment, his phone rang. He quickly stepped out onto the deck, but Lauren could hear the beginning of the conversation. "Yes, the paperwork is ready. She doesn't suspect anything. The whole day, Lauren couldn't find a place to be. In the evening, she went to Sid's bar again. "You know what the beauty of being a bartender is?" he asked, mixing a cocktail. "People tell us things they keep quiet about even to their loved ones, especially when something's bothering them." Lauren twirled the glass in her hands. Do you talk to Mr. Kane often? He comes in here almost every evening with Miss Price. They discuss some paperwork, finances." At that moment, Dexter and Aurora entered the bar. Seeing his wife, he stopped abruptly, but then confidently made his way toward her. "Darling, why didn't you tell me you'd be here? We could have had dinner together." "I tried calling," Lauren lied. "The phone was busy." She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the sound of the waves overboard. Something was definitely wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. Dexter was clutching her hand tightly in his sleep, as if he was afraid to let go. Lightning flashed outside the window. The storm was coming. Lauren threw on a robe and stepped out onto the balcony. The warm breeze ruffled her hair, and Sid's words about people who weren't who they said they were ran through her mind. After the night's thunderstorm, the morning was overcast. Lauren woke up alone. Dexter had left a note saying he had an early meeting. She went down to the bar where Sid was wiping down the bar after the night shift. "You look worried," he remarked as he poured her an orange juice. "I don't know what to think. I found a strange message from the insurance company on my husband's phone yesterday. Turns out he took out a huge life insurance policy on me right before the cruise." Sid froze for a second. "Maybe it's just a concern for you?" "Maybe," Lauren sighed. "But why didn't he tell me about it?" In the afternoon, the weather cleared. Dexter abruptly canceled all appointments and offered to spend the evening together. He made reservations at the ship's most luxurious restaurant. "I know I haven't paid much attention to you the last few days," he said over dinner. "Forgive me." The waiter brought champagne. Something glinted in Lauren's glass, a platinum diamond necklace. "This is for you, love. You deserve the very best." Dexter's hands trembled slightly as he fastened the lock around her neck. Lauren looked at her reflection in the mirror. The necklace was incredibly beautiful. After dinner, they went up to the upper deck to watch the sunset. The ocean was colored gold and scarlet. Dexter hugged his wife tightly. "Let's take a picture," he suggested. "A sunset like this is once in a lifetime." They took several pictures. In the last photo, Lauren noticed in the reflection of the porthole a strange expression on her husband's face, as if a shadow had flashed across his eyes. "I'll go get us some more champagne." Dexter kissed her and left. Lauren leaned against the railing, eyeing her new necklace. Footsteps were heard from behind her. "Nice gift." It was Sid, carrying a tray of drinks. "Dexter wanted me to tell you he's been summoned to the conference room urgently. Asked me to keep you company." "Work again," Lauren stretched frustratedly. "You know what's weird?" Sid lowered his voice. "I saw him go into the tech bay with Miss Price, but there's no conference room in there." Lauren felt a chill run down her spine. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another thunderstorm was approaching. "I need to find my husband." She headed determinedly for the stairs. "Be careful," Sid said quietly after her. The corridors of the lower decks were deserted. Somewhere in the distance, Lauren heard muffled voices. She moved cautiously toward the sound. The last thing she remembered was the silhouette of a tall figure at the end of the corridor and the sound of approaching footsteps behind her. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Dexter Kane had raised the alarm. His wife had not returned to her cabin after her evening walk. The ship's security detail immediately went in search of her. "I left her on the upper deck around 10 o'clock at night," Dexter explained to the officers. "Went to get champagne, and when I came back, she was gone. Thought she'd gone down to the cabin." Everything in their suite remained untouched. Lauren's cell phone was on the dressing table, and the necklace she'd given her the night before was next to it. The bed was neatly made. By dawn, the entire ship had been searched. Officers were reviewing security footage, interviewing passengers and crew members. Aurora Price had set up a headquarters in the conference room where all information about the search was flowing in. "Mr. Kane, tell us more about last night." The security chief was making notes in a notebook. "Did your wife seem troubled? Talked about anything out of the ordinary?" "No, everything was fine. We had dinner, I gave her a necklace. She was happy." Sid, who worked that shift, said he saw Mrs. Kane around 11 o'clock. She was standing at the railing, admiring the ocean at night. She mentioned she was going to look for her husband, the bartender added. Looked a little agitated. By noon, the captain announced over the loudspeaker asking all passengers to report any information about the missing woman. Screens throughout the ship showed a picture of Lauren, a blonde-haired girl in a white dress smiling at the camera against the sunset. "We have to consider all leads," the captain was saying in an emergency meeting, "including the possibility that she might have fallen overboard." Dexter turned pale. "No, not that. She couldn't have—" Coast Guard helicopters were combing the ocean along the liner's route. The ship slowed down and lifeboats were put on standby. In the cabin, Dexter mechanically went through his wife's things. A summer dress, a bathing suit, an unread book. On the table, a postcard of the Caribbean view she'd started a letter to her father. "Maybe we should check her cell phone," Aurora suggested cautiously. "Maybe there are some leads there." The phone was locked. Dexter shook his head. "I don't know the password." By evening, the ocean search had to be cut short due to worsening weather. A tropical storm covered the search area. The air conditioner hummed quietly in the empty cabin. A light trace of Lauren's perfume lingered on the pillow. The necklace Dexter had given her hours ago glinted dimly in the nightlight. The ship continued its journey across the night ocean, taking with it the mystery of the young woman's disappearance. After calling at the port of San Juan, Detective Hayden Frost came aboard, a tall man in a gray suit, with attentive light eyes and early gray in his dark hair. His first order of business was to demand full access to the ship's records. "Tell me again about last night." Frost settled himself in the Kane's quarters, scrutinizing every detail of the interior. "I've already told security everything." Dexter sounded annoyed in his voice. "And yet," the detective pulled out a notepad. "You had dinner, gave your wife a necklace, went up on the deck to watch the sunset. Then you left to get champagne and never saw her again, is that right?" "Yes. I looked for her everywhere." Frost made a mental note. "And why was her cell phone left in the cabin?" "I have no idea. Maybe she forgot it during the day." After talking to Dexter, the detective went to the bar. Sid was wiping glasses when Frost took a seat at the counter. "Coffee, please. No sugar." The detective placed Lauren's picture on the counter. "Tell me about her." "Nice girl. Came in often, usually alone. Looks like the honeymoon wasn't as romantic as she'd hoped." "What makes you think that?" "Husband was always missing meetings. Often sat here with his assistant, the red-headed one, Aurora." Frost spent the next few hours in the ship's office, studying the security tapes. One of them showed Lauren descending the stairs to the technical sector. The time was 23:15. She never appeared on the cameras again. That evening, the detective received a fax from headquarters. After studying the paperwork, he frowned and called Dexter back in for another conversation. "Mr. Kane, it seems your hotels are in a difficult financial situation?" Dexter visibly tensed. "Temporary difficulties? What does that have to do with it?" "Total debt is $15 million. 3 hotels are in danger of closing. And a week before the cruise, you took out a $10 million life insurance policy on your wife. Interesting coincidence, don't you think?" "What? Are you suspecting me?" Dexter jumped up. "I loved my wife." "Sit down," Frost said calmly. "Tell me about your assistant, Aurora Price." "She's been working with me for 3 years. She takes care of the finances and documentation." "And do your assistants often accompany you on your honeymoon?" Dexter was silent. Outside the window, the sunset was beginning to set, as bright as it had been that last evening. "One more question." The detective pulled out an envelope. "Explain why all of your hotels are registered to shell companies. Our experts have uncovered an interesting pattern." "I won't talk without a lawyer," Dexter replied sharply. "As you wish." Frost rose. "Just be advised. Right now it's still a disappearance investigation. But if we find your wife's body, this will be a very different conversation." Leaving the cabin, the detective headed for the radio room. He needed to send a request for all of Kane's bank transactions for the last month. Something told him this case was a lot more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Detective Frost sat in his temporary quarters, spreading out papers on his desk. The new information from the police department was forcing him to look at the case in a completely different way. "Look at this," He held out the folder to the ship's captain. Lauren Cassidy received an inheritance from her grandmother, $2 million and a house in the Miami suburbs, 3 weeks before the wedding. And right after that, Dexter proposed to her? Exactly. And a week after the wedding, all the money was wired into his hotel accounts. There was a knock on the door. Aurora Price stood on the threshold, pale and anxious. "Detective, there's something I need to tell you." Frost looked at her carefully. "Have a seat." "I can't keep quiet anymore." Aurora's hands were shaking. "Dexter, he made me help him. Said he'd tell on me about my paperwork shenanigans otherwise." "Go on." "This cruise. He'd been planning it for months. Picked out the itinerary, studied the layout of the cabins, the technical rooms, made me book this particular cabin, even though there were better options." Frost made notes. "Why this particular one?" "It's next to the service staircase leading to the technical compartment." Aurora pulled out a handkerchief. "I helped with the paperwork, with the insurance, but I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was up to." "When was the last time you saw Lauren?" "That night, around 11 o'clock. She was coming down the stairs, looking for Dexter." Frost called Sid into the cabin. The bartender looked worried. "I saw a strange thing that night," he began. "Mr. Kane went down to the technical compartment at about 11:30. Then Mrs. Kane went down there also, and an hour later I noticed him going upstairs alone. His hands were wet." "Why didn't you tell me about it at once?" "He threatened me. Said he had connections, that I'd be deported." The detective opened the laptop. "Take a look at these documents. Kane's hotels have lost almost all of their contracts in the last year. He's on the verge of going broke. The only thing still hanging on is Lauren's money. And the insurance," the captain added. $10 million in the event of her death." At that moment, a security officer entered the cabin without knocking. "Detective, we found something in the tech bay. Traces of blood on the pipes. And this?" He placed a broken necklace chain on the table. Frost stood up. "Where's Dexter Kane now?" "In his quarters. He's being watched." "Time to pay him a visit." The detective tucked the documents into a folder. "And this time I have every reason to arrest him." Lightning flashed outside the porthole. A thunderstorm was coming, but it could not wash away the traces of the crime committed on that fateful night. On the third day of the investigation, Detective Frost obtained a search warrant for the Kane's quarters. Dexter was by now under unspoken surveillance. 2 officers were watching his every move around the clock. "Mr. Kane, please leave the premises." Frost entered the cabin, accompanied by the experts. "We have reason to believe that there may be evidence in here relevant to your wife's disappearance." Dexter tried to remain calm, but the jowls on his face betrayed the tension. "This is absurd. I've told you before. I need a lawyer." "Absolutely. He'll be able to join us in San Juan. In the meantime, please wait in the conference room." As soon as Kane left the cabin, a thorough inspection of every inch of the room began. The experts examined the walls, the floor, the furniture. Special attention was paid to the safe. "Detective, take a look at this." One of the experts pulled out a stack of documents. "Deed of gift on a house in Miami. Mrs. Kane's signature looks strange." Frost scrutinized the papers. "Send it to forensics. Also, check the date. The day before she disappeared." At that moment, an agitated Sid entered the cabin. "Pardon the intrusion, but I have to tell you. That night, about an hour before Mrs. Kane disappeared, I happened to overhear a conversation in the service corridor. Mr. Kane was talking to Miss Price." "What exactly did you hear?" "He said, 'Everything must look like an accident. When they find the body, no one will suspect murder.' And she replied, 'The papers are ready. We'll wire the money in the morning.'" Frost made a note in his notebook. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "I was afraid. Then this morning I found these." Sid pulled out his smartphone. "Accidentally videotaped their conversation. Was just filming the sunset for my blog, and they got caught in the frame." The footage, though not very clear, showed Dexter handing Aurora some sort of envelope. The detective immediately sent the video to experts. By late afternoon, the results of the forensic analysis of the documents from the safe came back. Lauren's signatures were forged. Moreover, the experts found a whole package of forged documents for all the girls' property. "Look at this," the forensic scientist pointed to the dates. All the paperwork is backdated, and this is a draft will. It transfers all of Lauren's assets to her husband in the event of her death. They also found a hidden laptop in the cabin. It revealed correspondence between Dexter and a man about organizing an accident during the cruise. The emails were encrypted, but the experts managed to decipher them. "Detective!" One of the officers ran into the cabin. "They found a cache in the technical compartment. There's bloody clothing and this." A plastic key card to the utility room lay on the table. "Prince?" Frost asked briefly. "Already checked. Belongs to Mr. Kane." At that moment, there was a knock at the door. A pale maid stood on the threshold. "Pardon me, but there's something I have to tell you. That morning, after Mrs. Kane disappeared, I was cleaning the adjoining cabin, and I saw Mr. Kane carrying out a large suitcase. Very heavy, he could barely carry it. An hour later, I saw him without the suitcase." Frost immediately contacted the captain. "We need to check all the technical compartments in that part of the ship, and pull up the security footage of the cargo bay." By nightfall, an impressive folder of evidence had been collected. Forged documents, videotaped conversations, witness statements, traces of blood, recovered clothing. "I think it's time to talk to Mr. Kane." Frost closed the folder. "And this time we have every reason to have a serious conversation." Quick footsteps were heard in the hallway. It was a security officer running. "Detective, a message just came in from the port. In the cargo container that was unloaded this morning, the body of a woman has been discovered. Preliminary reports say it's Mrs. Kane." Frost looked at his watch. "Put out a general alert. Dexter Kane must not leave the ship." The thunderstorm overboard was getting worse, but it didn't matter now. The evidence was adding up to a clear picture of the crime, and the circle around the killer was inexorably tightening. Detective Frost stood in the service room, shining a flashlight into the dark corners. The signs of a struggle were everywhere. Scratches on the metal pipes, blood spatter on the wall, a broken heel from Lauren's shoe. "This is where it all happened." He ran his hand over the cold metal. "She came down looking for her husband and got trapped." At that moment, an officer ran into the room. "Detective! Aurora Price is requesting an emergency meeting. She says she's ready to confess to everything." In the interrogation cabin, Aurora sat with her arms wrapped around herself. Her red hair was disheveled, her eyes red with tears. "I can't live with this anymore," she began in a shaky voice. "Dexter, he's turned my life into a nightmare." "Tell me everything in order." Frost turned on the recorder. It all started 6 months ago. Dexter's hotels were mired in debt, creditors were demanding repayment. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, and then he met Lauren. Aurora took a sip of water and continued. "He found out about her inheritance by accident. He was checking hotel clients and saw her name on the list of heirs. $2 million and a house. It was a chance for him to save himself." "So the wedding was planned?" "Yes. He charmed her, rushed the wedding, and then he started to sign over all the assets to himself. But that wasn't enough. The banks demanded more. Then he came up with the cruise plan." Frost pulled out the photos from the tech bay. "What happened that night?" Dexter knew Lauren was beginning to suspect something. She might have discovered the forged documents. He lured her into the tech bay, saying he wanted to show her some kind of surprise. Tears rolled down Aurora's cheeks. "I waited upstairs, had to confirm that I saw Lauren walking around the deck alone, create an alibi, and then I heard a scream." At that moment, an officer burst into the interview room. "Detective! Dexter Kane is trying to get off the boat. He's commandeered the runabout." Frost jumped up. "Where?" "Lower deck, north side." When they reached the spot, Dexter was already lowering the rescue boat. In his hands, he held some sort of bundle. "Wait, Kane!" shouted the detective. "You've got nowhere to run." "I'm not going back to jail." Dexter's voice sounded hysterical. "You won't prove anything. We found Lauren's body," Frost lied, "and we have Aurora's confession." Dexter froze for a second, and that was enough. 2 officers grabbed him, plowing him to the deck. The envelope fell out of his hands. It was documents and cash. "Dexter Kane," Frost snapped the handcuffs on his wrists. "You're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Lauren Cassidy Kane." The courtroom in San Juan was packed. Detective Frost stood in front of the jury. spreading out photos and documents on a special stand. What happened on the Caribbean Dream cruise ship was neither an accident nor a spontaneous crime, he began. It was a carefully planned murder disguised as a disappearance. Dexter Kane's bank statements and hotel contracts appeared on the screen. 6 months before he met Lauren Cassidy, the defendant had lost control of his business. 5 hotels were on the verge of bankruptcy, debts exceeding $15 million, and then fate gave him a chance, a young girl with an impressive inheritance. The next slide showed the chronology of events: acquaintance, wedding, cruise. Dexter Kane didn't just charm Lauren. He studied her habits, tastes, dreams, figured out the size of her inheritance, planned a quickie wedding, and then he went into action. There was silence in the room as crime scene photos appeared on the screen. The night of the murder, Lauren discovered her husband's bankruptcy papers on his laptop. She went down to the tech bay to find it. That's where the fateful encounter took place. Aurora Price, pale and drained, testified. He said he just wanted to talk to her, explain about the debts. But Lauren already knew everything. She screamed that he married her for the money. Then he pushed her. She hit her head on a pipe. I helped him move the body into the dumpster. He said otherwise he would accuse me of complicity. Sid, testifying, told of overheard conversations, of Dexter's strange behavior that night. When it was Dexter's turn, he remained unperturbed. I loved my wife. This whole thing was a monstrous mistake. But the evidence said otherwise. Traces of blood in the tech bay, Lauren's forged inheritance papers, pre-negotiated life insurance, a carefully planned cruise itinerary with a convenient cargo port. Gentlemen of the jury, Detective Frost concluded his speech, what you have before you is not just a murder. This is the story of how a man, cornered by his own greed, destroyed a young life. Lauren Cassidy was only 22 years old. She believed in a beautiful fairy tale of love, but what she got was betrayal and death. The jury deliberated briefly. Dexter Kane received a life sentence. Aurora Price, given her cooperation with the investigation, 15 years. After the trial was over, Detective Frost met Sid at a coffee shop across the street from the courthouse. You know, the bartender said, stirring his coffee, I often think back to that last night. Her smile, her new necklace, the sunset over the ocean. In our work, every detail counts, Frost replied. Sometimes one word, one gesture can tell more than hundreds of clues. You helped solve this case, Sid. It's just too bad we couldn't have saved her. Outside the cafe window, the sun was setting. Somewhere far out in the ocean, the cruise ship Caribbean Dream continued its journey, taking with it the story of how greed and lies had destroyed what could have been true love. Detective Frost finished his coffee and stood up. There was a picture of Lauren on the table. She was smiling against the sunset, unaware that this would be her last night. Sometimes in the pursuit of money, people forget the most important things, he said. That some things can't be bought or faked, like true love, for example. Sid nodded. His glass reflected the lights of the evening city, so similar to the lights that had illuminated the deck of the cruise ship that fateful night.